Welcome to the Treasury Update podcast, presented by Strategic Treasurer, your source for interesting Treasury news, analysis, and insights in your car, at the gym, or wherever you decide to tune in. On this episode of the 2021 Outlook series, host Craig Jeffery sits down with Camille Felton, Principal Team Leader of Financial Analytics and Automation at Chick-fil-A, to discuss the future of work told through data stories. Topics of discussion center around new roles and developments at Chick-fil-A, innovative technology solutions, automation elements, and insightful case studies. Listen in to this lively discussion to find out more.
Welcome back to the podcast, Camille. It's been a few years since we've spoken on the Treasury Update podcast.
Yeah, thanks, Craig, for having me back. Excited to be here today.
I really like this concept of the future of work and rolling in some of these data stories. You and I have talked a lot. You've done many cool things at Chick-fil-A, and we've had a lot of conversations. I know we're going to have this broken out into two parts and look forward to it, but maybe we could start with your new role. You have a new position. You used to work in Treasury. You've done a lot of things with robots, with data. You've moved into a new department, but in a sense, as you described it, your activity has had the same flavor. So where are you now, and what are you doing at Chick-fil-A?
Yeah, certainly. So as you mentioned, I began my time at Chick-fil-A due to a banking background in the Treasury Department. I started there in 2015. Ultimately learned a lot about Treasury and a lot about FP&A, so got certified through AFP for both of those certifications, which was a great learning experience for me. But ultimately, as the team was able to grow within Treasury, we started to focus on other things beyond just the day-to-day cash data. We really were able to elevate my role to something that was ultimately my passion project. So it was a great win for Chick-fil-A, but also a great win for me personally and professionally, which is aligning my work effort as well as others' work effort around financial services to their unique value add that they bring to the organization. So specifically in Treasury, allowing the people that are working in the cash operations area to focus on cash operations, less about gathering all the data points and all the pieces of bank information that they need to do their jobs. So in 2018, 2019, we last spoke about we had just begun an RPA pilot at Chick-fil-A. And that RPA pilot ultimately spun out into what we now call the Financial Analytics and Automation team. Specifically, within that team, I sit on the automation side. Our team name is called Financial Solutions Lab. So whereas previously I was supporting primarily Treasury, at this point we are supporting all of financial services. And we'll talk a little bit about why we created that team shortly, but ultimately we needed a team to sit at the intersection of finance and the business. Or finance and IT. And so as you think about that, you needed someone to speak both languages, both the business language and provide that business context, but also to be able to provide that technical jargon so that those business cases could be actioned upon in IT. The last time we spoke, we had actually been on a journey with IT, which we call Digital Transformation and Technology at Chick-fil-A. So if I say DTT, it means the same thing to us as IT. But ultimately, they were doing what they were really good at, which is keeping the wheels on the bus, maintaining systems, making sure that the pipes that led in and out of those systems were working. And as we started in finance to think about the future of work, that's where we started to kind of lose alignment with IT, in that we wanted to focus more on that value add and think about automation and the future of work, and they were still maintaining systems. So as you thought about that, this is why that team was created, to ultimately sit at the intersection of IT and finance to help move some of those value add projects forward.
It sounds like, as you first started to describe it, I was thinking it was the historical business analyst role, sitting between there, describing business needs to IT and IT concerns to the business side. But As you talked about the future of work, and which is the topic of our conversation, it sounds like there's a bigger component there about, I don't know if you want to call it change management, process changes, visualizing how things are different. Is that
That's
fairly
exactly
close?
right. So as we thought about, RPA was one tool that we wanted in our toolkit to help financial services move forward. But as we thought about other tools and as we started to think about the future of work, we ultimately have a great problem at Chick-fil-A, and that is that people come to Chick-fil-A as part of their career and stay for a really long time. But the opportunity there is that we don't always have fresh eyes to processes. A lot of people have been doing their processes since the process itself began. So we knew we needed ultimately to think about, first, what do the processes look like if we went back and started over from scratch today? So a little bit of that process reengineering, but then figuring out what are the components that these teams ultimately need so that they can get to that automation phase or the future of work. So for us, that has been robotic process automation, or RPA, but also getting data and some of these processes reimagined so that we could kind of think about the dream state of less transactional, less manual work, and more of that value add that our accountants and our financial analysts and all those around financial services bring to our organization.
Yeah. So when we when you think about this new organization, or as you describe the organization, what are the goals of this group? What are some of the objectives? Is the mission to imagine the future of work, to make it happen? How would you describe that?
Yep. And I think the first step in sharing this with you is really taking a step back. You're probably very familiar with Chick-fil-A as a restaurant or as a quick service in the quick service industry, but you may not be familiar with Chick-fil-A from the corporate side. So we believe that our owner-operators are uniquely positioned to focus on selling chicken and building their communities, which is why Chick-fil-A corporate comes alongside to do many of the back office functions for them. So finance is really payroll for the operators, helping them with taxes, helping them with their monthly profit and loss statements and accounting as a whole. So we've even renamed our home office the support center. So I share all that with you to help you understand why we even do what we do within financial services. But ultimately, the journey began and the goals of this group started to get formed in a vision casting of what might it look like to really focus on finance of the future. We are a growing organization at this time, and we feel so grateful to be in that space. But what it means is that so many of the decisions made around the organization impact finance. And so those in finance, like at many other organizations, have overflowing plates. So how do we focus and how do we get finance to focus on the future of work when there's very little capacity to do that today? There's very little bandwidth to do that today. So the goal was to create 10% white space. And that was really just we like to call it big, hairy, audacious goal, or BHAG. But ultimately, the thought there was if we could save 10% white space or remove 10% of the transactional work effort that was happening around our organization, then what might that do for the plates of those in finance? What might they be able to do? And some of the things or some of the examples of what they might be able to do is we have expanded internationally to Canada. We are now being required in finance to really think about what are international implications for Chick-fil-A from a financial perspective, and maybe we didn't have time to do that with all that was going on. Another example that has resulted really grown since COVID began is on-demand delivery. So getting food to the customer when and where the customer wants it is a great opportunity for Chick-fil-A, but it has finance implications. We have to figure out the accounting behind that. We have to have the bandwidth to do that and to help. And so now as we start to remove that 10% white space or create 10% white space, we are able to really focus on the future of work. So that translates to 66,000 1,000 hours savings over 5 years. To date, I will share with you that we, at the end of 2020, we're about halfway towards that goal. The opportunity there is great, and we're really excited to continue this transition towards the future of work. But the last thing I want to highlight is this really isn't for Chick-fil-A a staff reduction opportunity. This is really about creating capacity and making sure that those that now serve in financial services have not only the capacity, but the tools to do work in the future. So we're really excited about this journey and the future of work.
So a question on that is, as you've been making this white space, it's not like your company has stayed stable. You continue to grow, open new stores, and expand. So while you might be freeing up this 10% white space, how much more is being piled into it as you free it up? So is this a never-ending challenge of making sure that there's white space for these other activities that don't get absorbed by the day-to-day or the new?
The goal is to get people to have bandwidth, but you're exactly right that as you free up somebody's time, they're going to find something else to do with it. And so one of the things that our leadership has been thinking about, and ultimately our people leaders specifically, is if I had extra time, or if my team had extra time, what would they do with that time? So what we're seeing is those same people that used to do accounting and have to gather all that data are still doing accounting, but the opportunity there is now maybe they're able to understand data better and start to build some of those foundations so that they can figure out how to create efficiencies and build more bandwidth into their job. They're always tasked with how do you work yourself out of a job, but make sure that whatever you are doing still gets done.
Now, as we move some of the discussion a little deeper into the future of work, you said something early on about the alignment of the work effort with people's unique value or skill sets and drives, and I know that's a key function of what you're doing. But this idea of the future of work and what you've done in this group, this certainly impacts how you imagine the future. And this idea of skill sets that are needed to get you there, to free up white space, to do more analytics, to support the business. This idea that people have strengths, strengths are not always in the same area in the same measure. They're not evenly distributed. And if you say, I want to force everyone to do it a certain way, you're going to suboptimize your team quite well. And I know you've given a lot of thought to this. Chick-fil-A has done this a lot, and I'd like for you to focus on some of the elements in ways that the audience and I can understand them. And when you talk about adapting people based upon their needs, how would you tell us what you mean by that?
Yes. So as with any organization, everybody comes to the table with different skill sets and you don't all want everyone to be an analyst. So the goal ultimately is to align the unique value add that everyone brings to the organization with the role they were hired to do, or the seat that they sit in. And so as you think about that, one of the opportunities there is that you have to upskill some people. So as you think about Financial Solutions Lab or the team that I sit on, our unique value proposition to the organization is that we sit in between that technical expertise and have enough business context to merge the two together and really drive work forward. But as you think about that, you ultimately need more people to play that role as you grow this opportunity. So one of the big instigating factors for us has been moving our ERP to the cloud. We are in the process of doing that, and this fall we'll actually move our ERP fully and go live into the cloud. And so the opportunity there is that the ways that we gathered data previously aren't going to be available anymore. So we have to figure out how to get the data to the people. And ultimately we figured out we have to upskill some people to make sure that the next generation of of reporting and data is accessible. So no one vendor can do this. No one team can do this alone. Tools are determining what the upskilling that's required. So in this instance, we actually have a reporting tool that used to sit directly on top of our on-prem database tables. And so that will no longer be accessible. So we have to figure out how to get the pipes in place to enable upskilling and to enable access to that data. So some of the tools that we're using we're using a lot of data lake in order to make sure that we can get the data that we need out of the cloud and into the hands of those around financial services to still be able to do work, but maybe in the process we can teach how to do work differently and kind of pose more and more data to them so that they can ultimately action upon it. The people that sit in these roles across financial services know their roles the best, and ultimately we want them to know their data the best across the organization. We no longer think that is just something that is the purview of IT. Aligning data and understanding of data is foundational to the future of work. So how do we get the data in the hands of our financial services staff is really crucial.
So you talked about data lakes and moving your ERP to the cloud. What are some other elements of this tool alignment? I know you don't necessarily want to list all the tools you use specifically, but maybe the categories. What are some of the elements that are part of this tool alignment?
So we believe that successfully optimized data integration parallels business integration. So what do I mean by that? If you have a centralized hub where all of your data across the organization sits, that is ideal because then you can tap into that data with any set of tool stack. So what do I mean by that? As you think about all these disparate systems we have today, and consider Excel one of those disparate systems. We may have the ERP, we may have bank data in Excel files, we may have other systems that we're using across the organization like the FP&A tools. And so all of that needs to be able to flow into one centralized place in order to then be able to connect all that data seamlessly. And so after you have that centralized location, for us, that's a data lake. But after you have that centralized location, you can figure out what tools help those that are trying to get their jobs done. What tools do you need? And what tools do you need for learning? And so some of that is you're going to have really technical people that know SQL or Python or other stuff, and they're going to be able to tap into that. But ultimately, we want everybody to be able to tap into this. This is not just those that are analysts that know how to use Alteryx and visualize with Tableau. This is also those that really want to just Google their data. They know how to, if they were on Google, they know how to key in what are breakfast sales yesterday at store 1234, but they may not necessarily know and have that data foundation. We still want to be able to enable those that are less technical and to ultimately upskilling them so that they're able to learn a little bit more about data, but also to think through what does it look like to do reporting in the future. A report in the future does not look like a report of the past, in my opinion. So as you think about that, a report in the future is more interactive. A report in the future is visualized so that you can understand and figure out what are next steps. But ultimately, all of that is enabled through data and a central place for all that data to be stored.
So, Camille, as you've used the phrase upskilling people to learn some of the newer tools, you've also described making the tools become more accessible, or making the data and analytics become more accessible. What's the bigger challenge, upskilling or making it so there's a democratization of access to the tools and analytics?
I think the bigger challenge for finance specifically is the upskilling side. IT is still there helping us build those pipes and making sure that all of the systems that we are now creating for the future are functioning as intended. And so one of the things that they've helped us with is data governance. We acknowledge that not every single piece of data should be seen by every single person in the organization. And so as we've worked through data governance, we've ultimately figured out 3 roles for Chick-fil-A. Each data set, so each piece of information within the data lake, has a data owner, someone who could ultimately say, take that out of the data lake, we're going to go away from that system, we're going to move to something else. Someone who has actionable insights related to that. Someone who owns it, someone who is a technical steward, so someone who knows the pipes and the underlying foundation of that. And then lastly, the business steward, so the person or the analyst within the business to really help make sure that that moves to the next level. So how does your team actually use that data? And if there's an error in that data, IT is not necessarily the one that's going to notice that. It's probably your business steward. And then the business steward can work with the technical steward to ultimately get that data fixed and back to your team. So it's really a conduit of all 3 of those in concert, but ultimately I think the tougher part for us in finance has been upskilling, because IT's helped us get the data into the data lake. Now how do we get it out and make it actionable and get insights from that?
So does the word steward appear on people's business cards?
Not yet.
On their digital business cards.
Right.
And I know there's some more I want to ask about that. I want to get into one of the data stories. One of them, we spoke last time, you did a lot with the RPA pilot related to bank statements. That was back in like 2018. I know part of the story is it's expanded. Maybe you can give us an update and tell us that story to get us going.
Yeah, certainly. So when I last spoke with you, we were talking about cash position automation. And so we were talking about ultimately getting the data from the banks all into one, at that time, one Excel file, so that we could ultimately start to figure out what our cash position was at a more readily available. So ultimately, we were manually doing our cash position every day, and someone was going out to each bank portal and looking at the bank balance and keying it into a spreadsheet. What we did back in 2018, 2019 was create a process from the point after we got all of that bank data and really automated. So we used a tool called Alteryx to start to think through workflow automation, and then from there we actually visualized it with Tableau. But having that bank data readily available was our goal. And so we actually started using RPA to pull down that bank data multiple times a day. Well, now we're looking at what does it look like to actually integrate with APIs. It's kind of the next phase of that automation is really even taking RPA out of the process and inserting integrations, because ultimately you want to use technology and systems to the nth degree as far as you can take them before you use RPA. RPA really just is to fill that last gap that has to be manual. And now with IT's help, that doesn't have to be manual. What used to be cash position automation from the perspective of getting that data and getting it all the way through towards visualization has now actually created a little bit more of a use case. And so now we're able to think through, now that the data is being pulled, now that the data is stored, now that the data is centralized, what might we be able to do more than that? And so one of the things that we've been able to do is dig into cash forecasting. So during COVID, we had a huge need to know how much cash we had at any given time. But in addition to that, we needed to make more connections throughout the business. So now that we have all that data centralized for the cash position, we can start to think through, if we added on the sales impact, what does that do to cash? if we added in some of these other pieces that we didn't necessarily have centralized before, like AP invoices. What does it look like if we had AP data centralized to impact cash flow forecasting? Ultimately, we've kind of added the power of and into cash positioning, because now we've thought about, because we have all of that data centralized, what other things could we do? And those use cases are growing by the day. Now that we have the data centralized, now that we have it into a place we can action upon it, and with the right access, so only those that need to see the cash data can see the cash data, but at the same time, they can now start to build insights that we never thought of previously, because we didn't have the data in a format that others could action upon it.
I like how it's unfolded. The vision was there. It unfolded in a linear manner, and then there was more that you could do as you saw it in play. Before we go back, I want to talk through another story.
Thank you for listening to the Treasury Update podcast. Please stay tuned for part 2 next week as we continue the future of work told through data stories featuring Chick-fil-A's Camille Felton, Principal Team Leader of Financial Analytics and Automation.
You've reached the end of another episode of the Treasury Update podcast. Be sure to follow Strategic Treasurer on LinkedIn. Just search for Strategic Treasurer. This podcast is provided for informational purposes only, and statements made by Strategic Treasurer LLC on this podcast are not intended as legal, business, consulting, or tax advice. For more information, visit and bookmark strategictreasurer.com.